Hello again, people. I have another section of text from Deleuze Guattari, their 1,000 Plateus, Capitalism, Schizophrenia, Volume 2. I will read. From Chapter 9, 1933, Micropolitics and Segmentarity. It's the last paragraph of the chapter, page 230. This brings us back to the paradox of fascism, and the way in which fascism differs from totalitarianism. For totalitarianism is a state affair. It essentially concerns the relation between the state as a localized assemblage and the abstract machine of overcoding it effectuates. Even in the case of a military dictatorship, it is a state army, not a war machine, that takes power and elevates the state to the totalitarian stage. Totalitarianism is quintessentially conservative. Fascism, on the other hand, involves a war machine. When fascism builds itself a totalitarian state, it is not in the sense of a state army taking power, but of a war machine taking over the state. A bizarre remark by Virilio puts us on the trail. In fascism, the state is far less totalitarian than it is suicidal. There is in fascism a realized nihilism. Unlike the totalitarian state, which does its utmost to seal all possible lines of flight, fascism is constructed on an intense line of flight, which it transforms into a line of pure destruction and abolition. It is curious that from the very beginning, the Nazis announced to Germany what they were bringing, at once wedding bells and death, including their own death and the death of the Germans. They thought they would perish, but that their undertaking would be resumed. All across Europe, all over the world, throughout the solar system. And the people cheered, not because they did not understand, but because they wanted that death through the death of others. Like a will to wager everything you have, every hand, to stake your own death against the death of others, and measure everything by delameters. Klaus Mann's novel Mephisto gives samplings of entirely ordinary Nazi speeches and conversations. Heroism was something that was being ruled out of our lives. In reality, we are not marching forward, we are reeling, staggering. Our beloved Führer is dragging us toward the shades of darkness and everlasting nothingness. How can we poets, we who have a special affinity for darkness and lower depths, not admire him? Fires blazing on the horizon, rivers of blood in all the streets, and the frenzied dancing of the survivors, of those who are still spared around the bodies of the dead. Suicide is presented not as a punishment, but as the crowning glory. Oh, that was the end of the quotation, I'm sorry. Suicide is presented not as a punishment, but as the crowning glory of the death of others. One can always say that it is just a matter of foggy talk and ideology, nothing but ideology. But that is not true. The insufficiency of economic and political definitions of fascism does not simply imply a need to tack on vague, so-called ideological determinations. We prefer to follow Fay's inquiry into the precise formation of Nazi statements, which are just as much in evidence in politics and economics as in the most absurd of conversations. They always contain the stupid and repugnant cry, "Long live death," even at the economic level, where the arms expansion replaces growth in consumption, and where investment veers from the means of production toward the means of pure destruction. Paul Virilio's analysis strikes us as entirely correct in defining fascism not only by the notion of the totalitarian state, but by the notion of the suicidal state. So-called total war seems less a state undertaking than an undertaking of a war machine that appropriates the state and channels into it a flow of absolute war whose only possible outcome is the suicide of the state itself. The triggering of a hitherto unknown material process, one that is limitless and aimless. Once triggered, its mechanism cannot stop at peace, for the indirect strategy effectively places the dominant powers outside the usual categories of space and time. It was in the horror of daily life and its environment that Hitler finally found his surest means of governing, the legitimation of his policies and military strategy. And it lasted right up to the end, for the ruins and horrors and crimes and chaos of total war, far from discharging the repulsive nature of its power, normally only increase its scope. Telegram 71 is the normal outcome. If the war is lost, may the nation perish. Here, Hitler decides to join forces with his enemies in order to complete the destruction of his own people, by obliterating the last remaining resources of its life support system, civil reserves of every kind, potable water, fuel, provisions, etc. It was this reversion of the line of flight into a line of destruction that already animated the molecular forces of fascism and made them interact in a war machine instead of resonating in a state apparatus. A war machine that no longer had anything but war as its object, and would rather annihilate its own servants than stop the destruction. All the dangers of the other lines pale by comparison. That passage struck me as really interesting, so I thought I'd post it. Hope you found it interesting too. Thank you.